So, okay, anyway, whatever.
All right. Hey, everybody. It's the first Wednesday of the month, so it must be Tech Talk Live time. So this is episode number 76. And today we are joined by an illustrious panel who will be discussing administering Alfresco running on AWS. So hello, panel. I'll introduce everybody momentarily. Before I do that, I want to get a couple of plugs in here. The first one is if you're in or near Moscow, then there is a Moscow meetup on May 15th. That is an all-day meetup, and I'm told that's a huge crowd that is going to be at that meetup. So if you're in the area, be sure to sign up and attend the Moscow meetup on May 15th. The next day is the Virtual Global Hackathon, and that will be happening all day long on May 16th, no matter where you are in the world. So what we are asking is for people that are interested to just spend their normal business day collaborating with other people around the world hacking on Alfresco projects. If you would like to do that in person, you're more than welcome to join one of the several in-person hacker rooms that have been created. There will be one in Maidenhead at the Alfresco office there in Maidenhead. There will be one in the Alfresco office in Sydney. There will be one in Brussels, one in Atlanta at the Alfresco office, and one in San Mateo at the Alfresco office. So,
hey, Luis, do you have the room booked in San Mateo for us?
Yes, I believe we do. I'll double check.
Great.
that would be a fail, yeah, if we
Yeah.
drove a lot of traffic and we ended up sitting down in the deli downstairs or something.
Yeah, and yeah, we don't want to do the deli, but we've got 8 people, I think, registered so far. So I sent an email reminder to see to make sure that people actually show up. So please do show up and let me know if you can't, so we can order food.
All right, excellent. All right, well, let's talk about Alfresco on AWS, and we'll get right into it. I know a lot of people are interested in this topic. So with me today we have Luis Sala. Hello, Luis.
Hey, everybody.
And you do a lot with Amazon, is that right? I mean, you're in charge of...
Yeah, so right, I'm managing Alfresco's relationship with AWS. So I'm like in conversations with them on a weekly basis, and we've got quite a few customers deploying Alfresco to AWS in a scalable, fault-tolerant, fashion. So it's really awesome stuff.
All right, cool. Next, we have Michael McCarthy. Hi, Michael.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
And Michael is the founder of TryBloom, and TryBloom is also an AWS partner and does a lot, and an Alfresco partner. So they do a lot of Alfresco projects and a lot of AWS projects and a lot of Alfresco on AWS projects. Is that a fair description?
That is very fair. We do a lot of projects on AWS, and we also do a lot of hosting of Alfresco on AWS.
That's cool. So if someone wanted to run their Alfresco servers on AWS, but they don't want to actually do the work to maintain those servers, then you do that for your clients. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
All right, cool. Next, we have Richard Esplin, as always, my partner in crime. Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Done anything with AWS?
I have done very little with AWS, but I do have a list of notes from previous conversations we've had about AWS that I can interject if I need to sound intelligent. But they're mostly things you guys already said that I wrote down.
All right, very cool. And Richard will be helping monitor questions that you guys are asking in IRC. That's pound Alfresco on Freenode IRC. So definitely get your questions in, and we'll get those asked to the panel. And finally on the panel is Steve Rigby. Hello, Steve.
Hi.
How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Coming in black and white today. Not all things are black and white, but today Steve Rigby is.
Indeed.
Indeed. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about what you do for Alfresco and how that relates to AWS?
Okay, so I am the manager of the CloudOps team, so DevOps, and we manage all Alfresco's production instances that run in AWS. So at the moment that's the my.alfresco.com service, and there's a few others which are on the horizon.
Very cool. Are we going to be able to talk about any of the stuff that you and I recently traded emails about that related to launching Alfresco instances on AWS and so on?
Yes, I don't see why not.
Okay, good. I was being cryptic for no reason, so okay. All right, great. So let's get started. Where should we get started? What's the first thing that we should talk about when discussing administering Alfresco on AWS? Oh, I can't hear you, Luis.
I was an idiot. I muted myself. Okay, so yeah, why don't we start with why you would want to do it?
Okay.
And Michael, why don't you take it?
Why would you want to do it?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the main reasons are you don't want to deal with the hardware yourself. It can be quite a bit quicker as far as actually setting up Alfresco goes. Boy, I'm kind of blanking out there. In a lot of ways, it's easier. There's a lot of things that are provided for you, like RDS instead of running your own MySQL.
I mean, one thing is the ease of requisitioning the hardware. So I've been in projects before where you sort of architect the solution and then you say, all right, we're ready to rock with this solution. And then you go talk to the IT guys and they're like, it's going to take us 6 weeks to get a box in, and we have to harden the box and blah 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 blah. So with AWS, it's as easy as just going, yeah, I'll take this box this size. So yeah. I think that to me the speed of deployment is a massive attraction to AWS.
Yeah, speed, agility, cost are all factors. I mean, consistency, right? Reproducibility, supportability, that kind of stuff. So what it boils down to is that our product and our architecture is very well suited for a deployment to AWS. The way that we developed our software just lends itself nicely to it. We support pluggable backend storage, and so we have an S3 connector, for example, that lets us use their Elastic storage subsystem. Alfresco is modular, so that allows us to break up certain components. So, for example, you could have a tier that's serving up just share, another tier serving up the core repository services. You could have separate tiers for dealing with Solar and transformations. All in all, it just gives you the ability to kind of break things out and then scale them independently as well. And then finally, from a cost perspective, you can optimize your costs based on the types of services that you're running, the load that your system is under. You may want to be able to address situations where you might need to elastically scale to deal with some seasonal high loads, and then shrink your environment back down to something a little bit more smaller for your steady state. So all in all, leveraging that infrastructure and the fact that our product lends itself nicely to a deployment there, it's all good stuff.
All right, so there's a question coming in via chat from Jinja Ninja. And Jinja Ninja is asking why go with AWS? Why not OpenShift or the Google Cloud platform?
They're all viable options, and OpenShift is more like a platform as a service, though.
Right.
So,
yeah, I don't think that one would.
Yeah, that's.
There is a community effort to build an OpenShift cartridge for Alfresco, but I wouldn't. It's not done and not very well. Working on it. That's the answer.
Well, let me just go ahead, please.
No,
I was going to say, as far as Google Cloud is concerned, there are some issues around compliance because they can't guarantee where your data lives. It can be, any state, wherever their regions are. They don't really say that, like AWS. If you start up a server in, in Oregon, it will stay in Oregon unless you move it, and that's not the same with Google.
Right. Although, from a purely, it certainly you have to be aware of what the infrastructure and their capabilities, what that translates to in terms of compliance with any regulations and so forth. There are some interesting things related to Google Compute Engine. First, the VMs look really, really fast. The machines look really fast. The networking in between their equivalent of regions seems to be really good, and that opens up opportunities for for wide scale or large scale distributed environments of Alfresco. There are some problems though. For example, if you wanted to use their managed database, Cloud SQL, which is, the label on it says it's MySQL 5.5 or something like that compatible. The reality is that there are some incompatibilities, and I've tested it, and it doesn't, out of the box, it doesn't work with Alfresco, and it requires us to do some changes to the way that Alfresco talks to the database and so forth in order to get it to work correctly. So all this translates to some challenges, but what it boils down to is that at the end of the day, AWS are the proverbial 800-pound gorilla. They created this market. They continue to innovate. They are more mature in terms of their overall service offering, and that gives them an advantage. And when we look at the fact that the bulk of our customers that deploy to a cloud infrastructure provider are deploying to AWS, I think that pretty much tells us that's certainly where we should be starting. I am personally not I don't have any problems, deploying and encouraging people to deploy to other clouds, be they Google, Azure, Rackspace's, OpenStack Cloud, etc. But AWS is a good place to start.
So, Luis, you mentioned that our architecture lends itself to deploying to something like AWS, and you mentioned that out of the box, Alfresco doesn't work on some other platforms. But when it comes to AWS, people can take the software and install it themselves and make no changes, or they can start with an AMI. I mean, what is the so I guess I'm just confirming that there's no difference. If you want to run Alfresco out of the box on AWS, you can do that. And what is the preferred way to spin up what might become a production Alfresco server?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple ways of answering that. So when it comes to production deployment of Alfresco, generally speaking, it's understood that we want something that's clustered, fault tolerant, etc., which automatically means that you may not want to start with just a single instance where Alfresco, the database, and the content store, where your files are, will be contained in that single VM, right? And that automatically complicates, if you will, the architecture, right? So I'd rather answer it as kind of like in two phases, right? Or if you want to just kick the tires, get to a feel for Alfresco and how it might behave in an AWS environment, you can do things like go to the AWS Marketplace and do a search for Alfresco Enterprise, and you'll see Alfresco Enterprise Edition available there as a single AMI that you can just run for 30 days as a standard 30-day trial. And you're up and running, and you've got your system there, which may be adequate for a production deployment aimed at a relatively small constituency of users, right? But once again, from my perspective, one of the big advantages of AWS is really kind of scale out. What happens. What you need to do to scale out, and how Alfresco can work well in that environment. And for that, what I encourage you to do is look at the CloudFormation template that we have that sets up a scalable kind of a multi-tiered Alfresco deployment. And there's some things that Steve can talk about in terms of tools that he's built for internal use that also do things like automate the deployment of a clustered, fault-tolerant Alfresco environment. So those are the two things that you can do, and it just depends on what you need to accomplish with your environment.
Steve, do you have anything that you want to add about ways to get started with Alfresco on AWS, or not even just get started, but just preferred ways of spinning up Alfresco instances in AWS?
Yeah, I think it is different depending on whether you're doing a trial or whether you're trying to put your production instances on there. As Luis said, trial, single machine, absolutely fine. If you're doing production, you need to do multi-availability zone, and you need to have some resilience. You need to have your clustering working, and you need to have a shared content store, so the S3 connectors ideal for that.
Now, speaking of the S3 connector, I get this question a lot, and somebody, Douglas, is asking about this right now. He's trying to run Community Edition on AWS, which that should be not a problem, Douglas. You can do that. But obviously, if you're trying to run clustered and take advantage of some of the scaling features of AWS, then you won't be able to do that with Community Edition. But what Douglas is asking is about the S3 connector. So I know that, Luis, you started a project that's, I believe, on Google Code for an S3 connector, and that will work with Community Edition and Enterprise Edition. But then, if I understand it correctly, the engineers took that and sort of productized that and made that enterprise only. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So I wrote the original version. I handed the reins, if you will, to Mr. McCarthy, and so I see a little sneer there. So I handed the reins over to Michael so that he can, if he wanted to, he could improve upon it. And in fact, he did. You did update it for Alfresco. What was it, 4.0 or 4.1? Was it?
I think it was actually 3.4 maybe.
Oh. Okay, never mind. So the point is that yes, Douglas, you are right in your observation that it has not been updated. Here's the problem. I'm not a full-time developer. I'm a hacker. I'm lazy, and I am very unapologetic about that. So if you want to use that connector and run it with the latest versions of Alfresco, download the source code. It's really not rocket surgery as far as how it's developed and how it works. Certainly, you need to understand the APIs and so forth. But collectively, what is it, like around less than 800 lines of code, I think, something like that. So it's not a lot of code to connect to S3 and use it. That said, over time, from the moment that our engineering team took the code and did an internal fork of it, we found certain performance bottlenecks that can be addressed with things like our caching content store and other types of things. We ran into issues related to files of unusually large size, and for some reason all of a sudden I've got Princess Bride stuck in my head here. But we've had to address those issues as they've come up, and as we see more and more production deployments using this connector. The simple fact of the matter is, it's now an internal, not an internal, but rather a commercial product, right? And so it's available exclusively to customers using Alfresco Enterprise Edition.
So that's what we love about Luis, is he leaves a trail of GitHub and Google Code projects in his wake everywhere he goes. But in all seriousness, if anyone does want to pick up that project and take it forward, they're welcome to do that.
So as an AWS newbie, why would you want to use S3 instead of just using EBS? So we should probably mention for the other newbies, you don't want to use instance storage because that's going to disappear. So you got to make sure to put it somewhere. But why use S3 instead of EBS?
So EBS is actually a perfectly valid place to store your files. The main reason why you may want to use S3 is if you have a cluster where 2 or more servers need to share a content store in common. And so in that context, S3 is doing 2 primary things for you. First, it is acting essentially as a file server, right? And number 2, it itself, because of the way that S3 works, it's a very durable object store, right? So it's very reliable, and you don't have to worry as much about potential data loss or anything like that. Now, let's assume that you wanted to have a cluster and not use the S3 connector. You can certainly do that. You can dedicate one machine in your environment to essentially be a file server and run NFS on it, for example, and have all the Alfresco nodes connect to that one, and that one in turn is using EBS volumes. And I think Steve might have some suggestions as to how you want to configure your EBS volumes in terms of provisioned IOPS and maybe RAID striping, etc., to get the most bang for your buck on that front. Right, Steve?
Yeah, potentially. To be fair, I'd always use S3.
Yeah. Yeah, S3 is certainly the most convenient way to go. That way you don't have to worry about managing and administering a file server.
Definitely. I mean, from an administration point of view, it's just so much easier. You don't have to worry about file, space and storage size running out. If you've got multiple nodes in your Alfresco tier, I imagine you probably have an independent Solar tier. They need access to the same content. So if it's all on S3, it's very easy.
Yeah. Now, where EBS, where we want to talk about both ephemeral stores, in other words, the instance-backed stores, and the and EBS would be where the database and the search indices are concerned. And I'm sure Steve has some advice on that front as well. I don't know if we want to jump ahead to that or keep talking about S3.
Before we move there, I have one more S3 question, which is, doesn't S3 have some performance implications? I thought S3 was slower than other forms of storage.
It's slow-ish. The S3 connector that ships with Alfresco Enterprise has multi-part upload capabilities. So when you hit 5 megs or more, it chunks the file, so you get concurrent writes. That makes everything a lot quicker. But it's not. I don't actually see any difference really in performance.
Well, it is a web service, so it's going to, it's interacting over HTTP, so it is going to have slower performance than, an SSD or whatever, for example. You can mitigate some of that, especially on reads with a cache and content store. And an instance or ephemeral store is a great place for a cache and content store because you don't need to keep it if your instance goes down for some reason.
Indeed, yes. You always want to use the cache and content store with it.
Yeah.
So before we dig in on general AWS performance questions, I think it'd be good to talk about database storage. So AWS has RDS, I believe it's called, and how's that different from running your own MySQL instance?
So RDS is an umbrella term, right? That's just a brand for essentially a managed database offering, right? And they support in turn 4 of the major databases, all of which are databases that Alfresco supports. In other words, we're talking about MySQL, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and Oracle. So, so generally speaking, the reason why you would want to use RDS versus running your database of choice on your own EC2 instances relates to that whole aspect around management. What does it mean, right? So in that case, AWS will take care of backing things up in accordance to your preferred backup strategy, upgrades of versions. They can do minor upgrades for you and help you out with major upgrades and stuff like that. So generally speaking, they're handling the day-to-day care and feeding of your database. Once again, offloading that workload from you and your IT staff, and in a similar fashion to why using S3 would offload a certain amount of workload from an operational perspective.
Right. There's also some niceties around. For example, you can take snapshots of your database, back it up on your own. You're not going to be able to do that with your own, your own MySQL running on an instance unless you write some code and do some administrative stuff around that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and the fact that you can set up multi-AZ RDS instances with the click of a button, and then you can create a cross-region read replica that goes into a completely different region for your disaster recovery.
Yeah,
they just make it so easy, and such a low operational impact that it makes sense.
Excellent. So I didn't want to distract us too much from the conversation we were starting about performance. So what are performance implications of running on AWS? How do you make sure you get the maximum throughput possible?
Steve has a lot of input on that front. So Steve, you take it.
Yes. Where do you want to start?
Start with the instances and then kind of work your way out to the other.
So I think Michael told us once that Michael said that on your benchmarking you found that Alfresco's definitely I/O bound, which has some big implications for how you size your AWS instances. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody knows that Alfresco is bound by the database and the file system. I mean, the code itself isn't really the slow part. I don't want to take it away from Steve, but yeah, I mean, start with the instance. The smaller instances have lower I/O capacity. Bigger instances have more capacity, and for Alfresco, you sort of need to start with an M3 large or an M1 large and bigger, but you should stick with an M3 because they're both cheaper and more powerful.
Yeah, I think since January, you want to move to the C3 class machines. We did, when they were first announced, we did a big benchmarking against those and the M1s and M2s and M3s that we're using, and they provided a considerable speed increase. So we've moved our usage over to C3s.
So, Steve, you mentioned the M3 instances. On paper, at least when you look at the AWS instance size pages and stuff like that,
yeah.
there's little noticeable difference in terms of what specs are revealed about the M3s versus the C3s. So could you elaborate a little bit more as to, in practice, what that actually translates to? Because I've noticed, for example, there's a difference in the amount of RAM available.
Yeah.
On what are supposed to be more or less equivalent C3s versus M3s.
I'm just double checking.
Yeah, for example, like an M3 extra large, I think is 16 gigs of RAM and whatever, like 17 or something like that.
I think we moved to C3s. We were on M1s and M2s just because of the balance of CPU and memory. And the C3s provided a good mapping against what the instance types that we were using in terms of the memory levels. And when we benchmarked them, they were providing at least double the single-threaded performance. And
right.
They're a fraction more, tiny bit more expensive, and I think they've come down since January. So, we're getting over double the performance out of the machines that we're paying the same amount for. In fact.
Right. So, for example, an M3 extra large versus a C3 extra large has, this roughly the same number of ECUs if you, trust the ECU measure, and half the RAM.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. And it's was it 50% more expensive?
Yeah, the price difference is.
And the C3 extra large is 30 cents an hour, and the M3 extra large is 45 cents an hour.
Wait, hold on. I'm looking here. M3 extra large, 28 cents an hour, and the C3 extra large, so same amount of
reserved costs there.
21. So anyway, well, we can discuss that later. But the pricing is roughly at par. It's the difference seems to be, at least on paper, it seems to be the memory. And I've just been curious if you were to choose between memory and CPU. Let me rephrase the question. Actually, what would you say is the minimum amount of RAM that you should allocate to an Alfresco environment?
I think it depends on your workload. The machines we run for my Alfresco, we give 8 gigs to the Alfresco instance and 5, I think, to share. I don't think either of them use that much, but we're running on a 15 gig machine, so.
Right, yeah, you're using the double extra larges, right?
C3 2X larges, I think.
Yeah, okay, cool. There you go.
Yep.
All right, so we've talked about machine sizes, and we've talked about storage, file storage. What's next?
So I had so aren't there a few operational concerns such as how you manage your IP addresses on AWS?
Yep, I can answer some of those. So we attach IPs to an ELB and then use the ELB address into DNS and assign a DNS name to everything. And then you don't have to manage your IP addresses.
Right. The trick here is that by using DNS, right, and being able to do things like have a low TTL, I assume we use a low TTL on our end, right?
Yep.
We can always swap out the IP address in the DNS entry, and it will resolve to the correct server, whatever that may be, even if we've had to switch IPs.
The IP address resolves to the ELB,
right.
and the ELB does all the magic against the IP addresses.
Yep.
Right, and so Amazon has Route 53 that does the DNS for you, which has some nice perks and can help you manage when servers are available and when they're not. ELB is an elastic load balancer for those who don't know what ELB means.
Yep.
So here's something that's being pointed out by one of our IRC folks. It says that he made a newbie mistake when setting up their first Alfresco installation. He or she, I can't tell whether it's a he or she, tried to segregate their UK users from their US users by using different servers, even though it didn't really matter because the servers were essentially next to each other, as it turned out. And so this is a little bit off topic. We'll take this up later, but now the question is how do they merge their Alfresco installation into a single server? So I don't necessarily think we want to take that piece of it.
It's not an AWS question, so I'm passing.
Yeah, but there is thought to how you should sort of set up your servers from for a geographically distributed.
Right, and certainly in that context, there are a couple of ways that you can, address some of the requirements around having a geographically distributed workforce that might need to, well, let's look at the reasons why you might want to have more than one Alfresco installation across geographies, and what it boils down to is having the server closer to the user for performance reasons, right? To reduce latency, both real and perceived, and I think perceived latency is something that needs to be addressed. Sometimes the user feels that something's slow when it actually isn't. So so that I would argue that accounts for at least 40% of the performance, poor performance that somebody experiences in an environment. But putting that aside for the moment, generally, as I said before, the idea here is to have the servers closer to the user. Now, what kind of content are they going to be accessing is one question that I ask myself, right? In other words, is the intent here for the users to have one common repository no matter where they are in the world? And if that's the case, then you would need to be able to replicate both the database and the files across these different geographies and make sure that things are kept in sync in more or less real time, and this is where you run into the big problem, with any application that uses things like a relational database, and it boils down to just speed of light issues over basically fiber and copper wire, right? So the further apart the servers are, physically, then the more latency there is when it comes to replicating database entries and transactions and files and stuff like that, which means that that expectation that a user might have of uploading a file, say, to an environment in the UK and having that same file available in say, a hypothetical Alfresco environment in California, for example, could take many seconds, if not minutes, to complete. And frankly, a database is just simply not a traditional relational database is not going to replicate fast enough and consistently enough to deal with that issue. When you look at how Google does these types of things and how large-scale organizations do it, they use a combination of sharding and eventual consistency and really clever, routing, and finally they buy tons of fiber. Right, I'm talking about optical fiber to connect their data centers in order to address this this inherent issue. Plus, they use their own custom databases, right? So in other words, they use a NoSQL database with very clever little algorithms built in order to address these types of concerns. And Alfresco is not that kind of application, not the way it's currently developed and written. So then, what's your alternative? That would be partition your data, so that if you know that you understand your users and you know that 80% of the time, users in the United States, for example, will be accessing, a certain subset of your overall content library, and users in Europe would be accessing another subset most of the time. Then you can leverage things like Alfresco's replication services to selectively replicate the the deltas or the other users, the other regions' data across those regions, and ultimately resulting in having a replica of that data, of the U.S. data in Europe, and vice versa. But the key thing here is that the way Alfresco replication services work is that the data is read-only. The replica is read-only, right? So if you wanted to edit the original, you would need to access it in the source environment, not the destination environment. I hope that makes sense. I realize it's rather convoluted, and without little graphics with arrows and stuff like that, it could be a little difficult to grasp, but that's the basic idea there.
But one point on the replication, just so people know, is the replication, that's all GUI. It's not hard to set up. You just go in the admin area and say, I want to replicate this part of my repository to this destination, and when the user wants to write, there's a link on that content that moves them through to the source server. So
right.
It's pretty transparent. It's not very painful, and it's a good way to go.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where also it benefits, of course, to have single sign-on and whatnot, so that if you're authenticated to environment A in Europe and you wanted to, and you click that link to edit a document that's in environment B in the United States, then you just get automatically signed on, and at least from the user experience is less jarring and much more fluid.
All right, so I mean that discussion that we just had about actually it will matter where you're running Alfresco. So whether you're running in AWS or on premises, it doesn't really matter necessarily. What are there any admin tasks that people have to pay attention to when they're running in AWS versus when they're running in their own data center? Is there anything in particular that we've talked about sort of some performance considerations and things like that, but are there any sort of regular tasks that someone that's running in AWS needs to pay attention to that they wouldn't otherwise?
All the typical tasks that you would encounter, backup, restore, having those kind of monitoring and so forth, you still need to address, right? And they're addressed. Some of them are addressed using conventional techniques. Others are techniques that are adapted to the class of environment. This idea of programmable, API-driven infrastructure, if you will. And so you need to leverage the capabilities that the infrastructure gives you to address those things. So, for example, for backups, you could leverage things like EBS snapshots, and that was hinted at earlier when Michael mentioned it, right? So there's that. There's some interesting implications with regards to things like the Solr or search indices, right? So, and in fact, Steve, I think it behooves us to learn a little bit about how we deal with Solr and how we leverage SSDs and EBS to provide us, both performance and durability.
Yep.
And there are, and then monitoring and whatnot. So I think Steve is very, a great resource to talk to, and then Michael might have some tips as well based on how he's been working with customers that have deployed to AWS.
Okay, yeah. Well, for our Solr tier, we used to have it on M2 4x larges, I think, with EBS holding the indexes. The EBS wasn't particularly fast. I think we had 3 volumes that we had a RAID on, and then we had another volume that we put all our backups onto. We've transitioned to C3 4x larges, which have a good amount of SSD. We've moved all the live indexes onto SSD, and we are noticing that we're getting at least 100 times throughput on I/O for the indexes. And then we use EBS to put all the Solr backups onto. And then when we do upgrades, we reattach the EBS volume, pull the backup down, and stick it back onto the SSD, and then use that as the live index.
Yep. So that's a very clever way of handling it, and you do have to keep in mind that there's a reason why this works particularly well for the indices, and that is if there's one subset of the data that is persisted by an Alfresco environment that one can afford to lose, it's the index, because Alfresco does have the ability to rebuild an index. So yeah, if you give it a backup of an index that might be whatever 24, 48 hours old, right? Yeah. Then Alfresco will rebuild the index from that last point. So therefore, you don't have to rebuild the bulk of it. You're only rebuilding the delta, and that's why that works particularly well. I'm not too sure how reliable this might be on an SSD-backed database instance, which might explain why RDS is always EBS backed, but certainly in this case, we're leveraging our knowledge of how Alfresco stores data and how Lucene/Solar works in order to get this great performance and durability compromise.
So I'd like to note that AWS is just like a regular server. You can RAID EBS volumes together to improve performance. You can also provision IOPS and increase that up to, I think they go up to 10,000 now. So that's another way to improve performance on EBS beyond trying to go to SSD or something like that.
Indeed, yes.
Yep. So certainly benchmark it, right? But the idea of using, since almost all these new instances are all SSD backed anyway, I have my doubts that you're going to get better performance in SSD even with maxed out IOPS on EBS for the indices, right? I'm being very specific here, but definitely benchmark the environment, and that could spare you from making the wrong choice, shall we say?
Yeah. One thing about EBS and provisioned IOPS is you do pay a lot of money for it if you're going for the highest IOPS you can get, and you still won't get as many as you will on the ephemeral SSDs.
Michael, do you have any other thoughts on Solar configuration or performance on AWS?
No, not really. That was all pretty good advice there. That needs to be fast. SSD is going to be your fastest instance store. You can recover from a loss, so it doesn't really matter if you lose it, but it's good to back it up so you don't have to rebuild the whole thing.
So, Steve, do you want to talk about what you've been working on as far as making it easier to provision Alfresco on AWS?
Yes, okay. I'll give a bit of background. So for our cloud product, we developed a deployment portal which allows us to deploy a production-like environment, which is 2 web nodes, 2 Alfresco nodes, 2 Solar nodes, and 2 transform nodes. And they're all tied in together using various config. But it lets QA and engineering deploy an environment for their use within about 15 minutes. That's from clicking the button to it being ready, full DNS access and everything. So we're in the process of extending that technology to deploy Alfresco Enterprise as well into AWS. We've got some provisional work done that will deploy Alfresco 4.2, and then we're creating some extensions to our tools that will allow for further deployments of Alfresco, the next versions, and also using theoretically any of the certified products that are supported by AWS. So at the moment we just support Tomcat and IBM, Sun Java, RDS, which is MySQL, and the plans going forward are to support the other versions of RDS that Alfresco support, also specific tier nodes for databases, and then the different app servers and other bits that Alfresco support. The goal is for internal use, so QA can test the products on it, support can create replication environments for customer issues, and it's all going to take sort of 15 to 20 minutes to get an environment running.
That's pretty cool. And so, is the idea that you would turn this on for other people to use that are not internal to Alfresco at some point, or?
That is one of the goals of the product. Yes, so that it will be accessible by partners to deploy Alfresco to AWS, and also potentially to individual companies if they want to manage their own deployments. But that's still work in progress at the moment.
That's cool.
Yeah. No guarantees at the moment, right? We're working on getting approvals and funding.
Well, the goal is that it deploys Alfresco certified config with Alfresco certified product, so that you're deploying everything as per Alfresco intends. And for a lot of companies, hopefully it's going to remove a lot of headache for deploying Alfresco.
Yep. So.
Cool. All right. Looks like we have another question coming in from IRC from Douglas here, who is asking, what is the best way to keep a server machine image such that you could deploy copies of it anytime you need to? And Douglas is saying that he knows about AMIs, but is wondering how that works when you need to change host names and other things that are specific to a given server instance.
Right. Here's where you need to add some automation, if you will, and essentially you want to make your instances self-configuring after a fashion, and there are different ways of tackling it, but what it boils down to is that you need some form of scripting, so that, for example, when a instance is launching, it can pull certain configuration details about the environment from some location, some registry. Nowadays in the DevOps world, Chef and Puppet are common ways of scripting the deployment of these large environments. You might want to look at the Alfresco CloudFormation templates because they do that in a more simplistic fashion, where we essentially load up as an instance bootstraps, it downloads some shell scripts that allow it to pick up this information directly through CloudFormation. But what it boils down to is that these are essentially self-configuring machines, right? And we need to pass along just enough metadata to the environment as it's starting up so that we can then write the appropriate values into the Alfresco configuration files. Things like, what's the name of the S3 bucket that we're going to be reading and writing from? What's the DNS name of the RDS instance that is acting as our database? All these types of things would need to be retrieved dynamically, and AWS has APIs to retrieve these types of things. But the larger your deployment gets, the more complex it gets. You might want to have more capabilities, and that's where Chef and/or Puppet comes into play. At Alfresco, Steve can tell us a little bit about how we use Chef, and we're transitioning from Puppet, right? Or we have transitioned from Puppet, if I recall. So we've decided to go down the Chef route, if I understand correctly. But Steve can clarify.
Yes, that's right. We use Chef. I think we transitioned about a year and a half ago.
All right.
It surprises me. What was the logic to move from Chef to Puppet, or from Puppet to Chef?
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of other things like Salt and Ansible out there too.
Yeah. So when we transitioned, Salt wasn't in configuration management. It was more for remote command execution. I think we moved to Chef because it was deemed easier to manage configuration blocks. Our sysadmins sat down and brainstormed the pros and cons for both, and Chef won. So that's what we moved to, basically.
So let me add to that I prefer to build servers further back so that you're actually installing Alfresco. You're not creating an AMI with Alfresco, the database, and all that stuff all in one big chunk. But you can configure it further back, and then you don't have to worry about those things quite as much. So it's always a trade-off between time to start up and how much effort you have to do on the scripting part after it's started up.
Yep. And there's some clever things that you could do. For example, you might build the first machine in your environment dynamically, so you basically start with for all intents and purposes, just the base operating system and just enough scripts so that it downloads, installs, and configures the environment. And then you can take an image of that, and then you launch that image. That way your bootstrap time for these new environments is a lot faster because it doesn't have to download and install any additional artifacts. And the CloudFormation template does this in a very simplistic fashion when it comes to launching the additional servers, and you can do the same thing using any of the configuration management and types of tools.
That's exactly what we do. We use the base CentOS 6.4 AMI, and then we use Jenkins job that does a Packer job to pre-configure a load of the required bits of software, and then we launch those AMIs and overlay Alfresco and all the various config using Chef.
All right. Any other thoughts on configuration management?
It's a whole other discussion, I think. Like, you know, you could do a whole session on, and it's all, these are best practices that DevOps teams, you know, worldwide have been figuring out and working on over the last couple of years, particularly since the advent of AWS-style cloud infrastructure, but certainly even before then. So it's a whole discipline associated with that.
All right. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions. We have about 10 minutes left on the call, so go ahead, Richard.
Another topic I want to hear your thoughts on is just the challenges of working with Alfresco on a remote environment. So I know there's some tricks to getting JMX to work. I know Michael and I were working through how to get access the JavaScript debugger. What are some of your tips for being productive when you don't have the server in your control?
Sure, it's really no different than any other remote server. So you don't have a monitor attached to the machine. You have to do everything remotely. So you know, start with SSH. You also have to worry about firewalls and security groups, unless you happen to be running in a VPC with a virtual connection, a virtual private network connection to it. But yeah, I mean, you know, I work on a Windows box, and usually I run AWS Linux boxes. So you know, if you have an X server locally, that helps. If you want to set up VNC, that helps. And then just, you know, knowing how to deal with X and display settings and X host and those sorts of things really help a lot.
It's a networking, in other words.
What'd you say, Luis?
It's a networking issue. It's all about routing. You know, you just got to figure out what ports you need to connect to. Yes, there's sometimes some additional configuration, but you know, the main thing is that since you don't have the monitor attached, you know, you need to use networking to get around it.
Yeah, and to be really concrete on some of those, when Michael was trying to get the JavaScript debugger launched, the way he'd do that is he'd SSH into, and correct me on the details, Michael, but he SSH'd into his AWS instance, and then it was running a desktop on that instance that he could connect via VNC, and then added the display variable into the Tomcat, into the Tomcat environment script, so that it would tell Alfresco to launch the JavaScript debugger on the display that his VNC was connected to, and in that way you can access that JavaScript debugger when you're doing your development in AWS.
Right, and there's actually one other piece to that, which was I actually had to enable the Tomcat user to use the X display with an X host plus.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious,
it took a while to figure out.
why would you want to do that versus just developing on your local machine?
Well, you know, for people like us, partners, we have potentially tens or more of clients that we want to deal with, and it's sometimes a lot easier just to spin up a VM, an AWS instance, and deal with that instead of trying to keep track of, you know, 10 or more local.
Yeah. Nope, got it. Perfectly clear.
I think the other use case is if you're dealing with if you're testing in a staging environment and you need to work with that data for debugging for some reason.
That's true too.
Yep.
More than once I've been in that situation.
Got it.
So how do you get JMX to work when it's not on your local machine?
Well, actually, I've got some instructions. I think I did it in a webinar for Alfresco back in 2012. But there's an addition to Tomcat that lets you specify the ports that JMX will connect on, and then you can open up the ports in the security group, and then you can just connect to JMX on a specified port.
Yeah, we have that config running on our cloud environments.
Yep. So how about VPC versus no VPC? Yeah. So any best practices there?
I think with almost everything, it all comes down to what are the requirements. It's certainly best practice to have a VPC and have your instances sort of, firewalled off from the rest of the world. But if you don't really have security requirements, you're dealing with public information anyway. Does it matter really all that much? I don't know. Probably, but it's up to the customer really.
Certainly, AWS recommends that you use VPC. Right.
It gives you a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. So you're probably better off defaulting to VPC and then find reasons perhaps not to use it. But
I think you are defaulted to VPC by default now because you can't not do that if you have a new AWS account.
So I think I got grandfathered in. So
yeah, any new accounts.
Yeah, I think it's been the default for a while now.
Yeah. They defaulted. Yeah, they started that over a year ago, I think. Yeah. Right.
All right. Any last questions, Richard, that are coming in over the wire or that you've got?
I was just looking. That's my list of topics. I found that very informative. Looks like we're all caught up on IRC questions, and I don't see anything on the Google Plus page either. So very interesting. It's definitely a powerful tool to build some pretty complex Alfresco instances without having any hardware to worry about.
I'd like to ask a question myself, if that's all right.
No.
As far as Alfresco goes, according to the supported stacks, RDS is not supported. I don't believe CentOS is supported either. Is that coming, and will AWS or Alfresco support those even though they're not, quote, supported?
So there was a misunderstanding. I just got back from the UK last week, and as far as RDS is concerned, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding about RDS. Is RDS a database? No, it's not. Right? It's just a brand, right? And so it's really more about the underlying databases. So I had a conversation with our head of QA about this. He wanted to find out the specific versions of MySQL, Oracle, etc. that are provided via RDS, and I've supplied that list. It's buried under the FAQs, by the way. So it took me friggin' hour to find the precise version numbers, but what it boils down to is that he's much more comfortable with the idea of supporting RDS. So so the next thing that he wants to make sure is that we define a support policy specifically on what it means to support Alfresco and RDS, and I think it's going to be a combination of things like best practices for doing backups and restores, how we deal with situations when, say, AWS, forces an upgrade upon a customer, a database upgrade, where it might require some database migration or something, right? And so how is it that Alfresco, needs to support it, or if we do at all? So what's our stance on those types of issues? So I think it becomes more of a procedural matter as opposed to now kind of saying, is RDS supported? Well, the answer will be yes, soon enough, I think. So I'll stay tuned on the official word as far as RDS is concerned. CentOS is a different matter of sorts. I don't, we know that Red Hat and the CentOS team have teamed up now, which I think can and should add a level of comfort as far as CentOS is concerned. But that's up to the QA team. We test so many stacks, right? We have to QA different permutations and whatnot, and it becomes a really tedious, lengthy process. Despite our heavy use of virtualization and automation and stuff like that, it's very painful. So for a very risk averse, QA organization, which many QA organizations are risk averse, it's you need to make sure you do it for the right reasons. So I can't speak to CentOS as to whether we will do it. I think it makes sense for us to do it, but something's got to give at some point, and we may have to drop other things from our supported stack in order to accommodate another, in quotes, operating system.
Though it's good to understand with the support policy, and I know you understand this, Michael, but in general, Alfresco support, the idea is that if there's a problem on the stack you're running, then the support team doesn't say, oh, we won't touch that. Instead, they say, can we duplicate it on a supported stack? And as long as they can duplicate it on a supported stack, then they continue to help you as if you're on a supported stack. So, if you decide to run on CentOS instead of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you accept a little bit of responsibility in that debugging process to figure out a problem. But it's not like we just say, oh, we can't help you. We still go ahead and help you.
Risk-averse, customers tend to prefer to, stick to the supported matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Did we lose Steve?
I think we lost Steve, but he may have had a hard stop because we're at the top of the hour.
No,
he looks
back.
like he's coming back. Hey, Steve's back.
I don't know. I have no idea what happened there.
Well, I think we should probably end the call. We're at the top of the hour here, and this has been very informative and educational. I appreciate all of the panel. You guys taking the time to spend with us this morning. Very cool. Thank you very much. And just a reminder, Moscow, May 15th, and Virtual Hackathon, May 16th. So I expect all 4 of you guys to be participating in the Virtual Hackathon. And if you're not going to be doing that, then please tell us why, and we'll post that publicly so people can decide whether that's a good reason or not. But anyway, all right, great. Well, thanks. We'll see you, everybody, again next month for the next Tech Talk Live. Do we have a topic, Richard, for next month?
Well, no, we don't have a topic yet.
All right, so community, get us those topic suggestions, and we will get something figured out for next month.
Worst case scenario, I'll share my recipe for the best burrito ever.
Do burritos need recipes? Is it not that complex?
How about the carnitas? How about the carnitas?
Ah, okay, okay, cool.
As I have to tell my family, it's all about how tightly you can roll it. The burritos are all about a tightly rolled wrap.
All right, and with that, we will hang up. I will see everybody next time. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Cheers.
Bye.